So today we are going to be moving on to a new aspect of study designs, and that is going to be a discussion on writing a systematic review meta-analysis protocol. Our presentation is going to cover the following outline. We'll look at what a systematic review is, what a meta-analysis is, why should you do a systematic review, why should you write protocol first. We'll go through a step-by-step process on how you move from an idea to a protocol. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Prisma P guidelines. As learning goals, our hope is that at the end of this session, you should be able to understand what systematic reviews and meta-analysis are. To be able to explain why protocols matter for systematic reviews and or meta-analysis, you should also be able to describe the key steps in protocol development and to apply the Prisma P guideline to guide your protocol writing. And lastly, you should be able to draft or assess a protocol with much confidence. So what is a systematic review? A systematic review can be defined as a structured, transparent, and reproducible method of synthesizing evidence from multiple studies to answer a specific research question. So a systematic review is just one type of literature review. As we saw in the earlier module on literature review, unlike the other forms of literature review, it is really more robust as it is structured, and you have to ensure that you do it in a transparent manner, which is the whole point of writing a protocol before you start. And a systematic review, unlike the other forms of literature review, should be reproducible, meaning that if people follow the methods that you've used, they should be able to arrive at similar results. So the process is some sort of, you look across papers that exist on a topic or on a subject that you are interested in, and your goal is to pick out some of these papers that meet a certain inclusion criteria that you have to define, and then bring those papers together through synthesis, meaning that you kind of summarize the evidence together, combine the evidence in such a way that you produce a comprehensive report which answers the research question that you aim to answer at the beginning of your study. The key features of a systematic review include a predefined protocol and criteria. So this is very important. Other forms of review like scoping review and the rest will not need you to write the protocol. But if you say you're doing a systematic review, the systematic reviews means that you have to be really robust. And for that reason, you must define your protocol and the criteria that you're going to be using for conducting this study early on in that protocol. Secondly, you must develop a comprehensive search strategy, as we are going to see in subsequent slides. And you must also apply rigorous study selection and appraisal methods. We'll look at all of them in the slides that will follow. So, what is a meta-analysis? Sometimes you can do a systematic review without a meta-analysis. You can do a systematic review with a meta-analysis. And you can also conduct a meta-analysis alone. So what is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is a statistical technique used to combine results from multiple studies to derive a prevalence of an effect. So think of a meta-analysis as some sort of a quantitative systematic review. So you can have a systematic review where you're trying to combine numerical data or quantitative data from different papers. And you are going to bring together these different numerical values, which could be a prevalence, could be a mean, could be a mean difference, or other form of numerical data. And you pull this to have one combined estimate, which is called the pooled estimate or the pooled effect size of interest. So what you see on this screen is a forest plot, which is an example of a meta-analysis combined on several studies. And this is a meta-analysis of prevalence. So you are combining prevalence values. On this side, you can see each of the studies. We have some subgroups and the first author with the country where the study was done. And for each study, you can see its prevalence value as reported in each of those studies. And you can combine these prevalence values to have the pool effect size or the pool prevalence for that study, which we have here as a summary. And you can do that for different subgroups, and you can have an overall estimate. So we are going to see in more detail later. But the key point to note here is that a systematic review can be done with a meta-analysis or not. And the purpose of a meta-analysis generally is to increase the power. So for example, you might want to bring in more studies and increase the sample size. And with a larger sample size, you can be more powered to determine a better effect size across multiple studies. Also, it also improves the precision because with a larger sample size and more studies, you have more precise estimates. But there is a caveat here. There are also issues of whether these studies are similar, and we are going to see that in detail. And this meta-analysis can also help identify patterns across different studies. When do you use meta-analysis? You use it when you have sufficient studies and you're combining studies that are quite similar as well in terms of design and the outcomes that you're assessing. So you cannot be combining means with prevalences. You cannot be combining maybe standard mean difference with the prevalence. You also use it when you have quantitative data. So you cannot talk about meta-analysis if the kind of data you are dealing with is, for example, qualitative data or categorical data. So why do we conduct systematic reviews? They help us to objectively evaluate the quality of evidence on a given topic. So because you're bringing together different papers, you synthesize the evidence from these different papers to actually have a sense of the quality of evidence that exists on that given topic. They also help us to summarize and make sense of a large body of literature. You know, it's very hard for people to read across different papers. So if you have a systematic review that has been published, it's easy for you to just go to that review and read the evidence that has been synthesized and put together for you to understand in one simple step, unlike a typical process where you have to read each paper and then critically appraise and make summary notes and all of that. So systematic reviews really help streamline that. For example, if you're about to write a paper or you have a research question that you want to explore, it might be nice to see if a systematic review already exists on that topic. And by reading it, it can really give you a good sense of whether your study fits in what's already available or give you a sense of whether what you're doing is also important. And systematic reviews also help to resolve or highlight contradictions in existing research. We know very well that for a given research question, people might publish results that are positive, some negative, some indifferent. So a systematic review can help bring those kind of evidence and discover them. It can also help you to identify the need for additional research. This is particularly important today in grant writing because sometimes before you write a grant, you might want to demonstrate that that grant is going to be fulfilling a need. And a systematic review is usually a very good step to do that. So for a very strong grant application, you and the team might want to start by conducting a systematic review to lay out the landscape of the evidence and to demonstrate that there is need for further research as identified by your systematic review. Systematic reviews also prevent unnecessary or redundant studies. So if a systematic review has been done and the evidence from that review is clear and is very robust, then you have no need to conduct another study for it. They are also the bedrock or, or the pillar for clinical decisions, not just for clinical decision making, but also for practice guidelines. Like in medicine, almost every step that the clinician takes is informed by a guideline. And these guidelines are developed by looking at evidence. And one way to have strong evidence is to conduct systematic reviews. And this is the same for health policies. Robust health policies are usually informed by robust, well-conducted systematic reviews. Lastly, these systematic reviews really save clinicians and researchers in general in terms of the amount of time that it takes to review individual studies to find evidence. So these are why platforms have several platforms for evidence synthesis have emerged over the years, like CRENC and some other ones that exist within the US systems and the UK and Europe. These platforms have become like the go-to place for synthesizing results from clinical trials across different clinical trials, and sometimes even from observational studies. So why write a protocol first when conducting a systematic review? And like I mentioned, the systematic review is very important. It means that you have to be very, very process-oriented, and you must be robust and comprehensive. And so the way you want to do it is similar to how you want to construct a building. If you want to construct a building that will last, is solid, you must start with a plan, some sort of a blueprint. And then from there, you build your house based on that plan. You don't want to build a building and at some point you say, oh, I would like to add a staircase, and you didn't plan that. That might be very difficult and might bring structural concerns. That's very similar for the process of developing a systematic review. You want to lay out the protocol, and this protocol will serve as a guide for how you're going to go about the different study procedures. So the protocol will outline what you are going to do when you actually start the study. So this protocol helps to prevent bias and selective reporting. So by outlining the protocol, it will prevent you from some sort of introducing new ideas, new concepts that might take the study in a different direction. Because there's always the temptation that if you see the papers, at some point you might change the research question or start modifying some aspect of it, which introduces a lot of bias. And you might start putting out studies, introducing new studies. At the end of the day, you are not truly answering the research question, and you are not producing a systematic appraisal on the research question. Secondly, this protocol will help you ensure transparency and reproducibility. Transparency and reproducibility are key concepts today in research because they are very, very important, not only for systematic reviews, but for other types of studies. People are really worried whether people are applying the right methodology and statistical methods. So by defining it early on in a protocol, that I'm going to use the following steps, and this is how I'm going to look for the papers, this is how I'm going to combine them, you make it very trustworthy for other people who are looking at these results later to trust that this was well done. And if someone else wanted to maybe update your review, they might need this protocol. And it's based on this protocol that they are going to see if this was well done and whether they can leverage those methods that you used. And lastly, the protocol is kind of the foundation for trusting the final result of your review. So when you submit your final review to a journal, there is almost always mandatory that you must have submitted a protocol somewhere. And we are going to see the different ways that you can prepare that protocol. And so a well prepared protocol is really a strong signal for a trustworthy review. So we are going to follow 7 steps in this presentation. And these steps are the different considerations that you should have from the idea to combining the evidence. In the first step, you want to frame your research question, and the PICO framework is a very well recommended and strong strategy for doing that. Then you want to define the eligibility criteria for the studies. How do you determine if a study matches or fits into your protocol? thirdly, you want to define the search strategy. So you define a strategy that is sensitive and specific enough to pick the papers that you need. The fourth step, you want to plan study selection. So you're going to screen titles and abstracts, screen full text, but you must define that in your protocol. In the fifth step, you have to decide on the kind of data that you want to get from each of these papers and how you're going to lay out different aspects of the papers that you're going to, of the data points in the papers that you're going to obtain. The sixth step, you must ask conducted in different sets, different study populations, and so on. So by assessing risk of bias, you help to kind of assess whether you are really combining evidence that makes sense. In the last step, you must describe and outline the strategies for combining the results from the different papers. In other words, this is called synthesis, which can be a quantitative or qualitative synthesis. So for this presentation, I will very much use this protocol that we've published on plus one. And it was a protocol for a review where we sought to determine the prevalence of selected cardiometabolic risk factors in the global ART-naive HIV-infected population. And it was a protocol for both a systematic review with a component of meta-analysis. You can see the detailed protocol here. But before we prepared this full protocol and published it, we made a shorter protocol, which we published on Prospero. So Prospero is kind of a repository for registering protocols. It's similar to the repository for registering clinical trials before you start them. So you can either prepare a short protocol or a full protocol. You don't need to do the full protocol, but at least you should always do a short protocol. So we are going to start with the first step. And the first step is really framing your question with the PICO framework. I will not go into details because we've literally covered this repeatedly since module one. So you want to be clear about the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome, and also the type of study and the setting. And by using the PICO framework, as we know, this ensures clarity and focus. For example, if you're doing a systematic review that is interested in determining the prevalence, you'll just be interested in the P and O components of PICO. So something like what is the prevalence of maybe hypertension among middle-aged adults in Boya. And so I'll give the example that we used in our paper, and these are direct screenshots from our paper. So our review questions were, what is the prevalence of obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia in the global ART-naive HIV population? And secondly, we also wanted to ask what is the association between HIV-specific factors, including time since HIV diagnosis, severity of disease, CD4 count, and viral load, and these different selected cardiometabolic risk factors. So once you've determined your research questions and framed them very well, the next step is to define your eligibility criteria. So how does a study qualify to be included in your review? And so you have to kind of lay out some inclusion, some exclusion criteria for the various studies. And this criteria can build very much from the PICO framework. So if you use the PICO framework, it also really helps you to define the eligibility criteria. And these components, the components of PICO, such as the population, can help you to know I'm including people from this population. The study design, studies using what language, when were these studies published? So the publication date is very important. And this eligibility criteria also helps us to maintain consistency and reduce selection bias. So without a criteria, you might end up with studies that are not really important and are not consistent in answering your research question. And also by defining it earlier, it helps you to get exactly the kind of studies you want. So from our protocol that we published, you can see in the materials and methods section that we laid out the eligibility criteria, that is the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. And these are the different aspects of that we considered for the inclusion criteria, the study design. We're interested in cross-sectional studies, case control studies, and cohort studies because they often provide baseline data for estimating a prevalence. And we also looked at ART-naive patients, that's age 15 years and above, living with HIV from any part of the world. And the clinical outcomes of interest were the different cardiometabolic factors as we saw, as we outlined in the research question. And we were considering studies at all times. So we were not having a time limit, we're not time bound. And we're looking at studies that were both community-based and health facility-based. And we included studies published in both English and French. And in the exclusion criteria, if a study did not report prevalence values, because this was our primary research question, or did not have sufficient data for you to, numerator and denominator data for you to estimate the prevalence, that study did not qualify. We also excluded case series, case reports, clinical trials, commentaries, editorials, and so on. And also studies that were not performed on human subjects. For example, studies in mice, studies in gorillas and monkeys and so on, or studies that were done in other languages. So after you've done this, the next step is to define your search strategy. And for you to do this very well, you must consider what databases would have the papers of interest. And there are different databases that are available. You could have PubMed, that's the search engine, and the database is Medline. You could have Stina, you could have Opus, and so on. We cover this in the module on literature review, and so I will not repeat that too much. And some two key aspects that you are going to also consider when you are building your search strategy is merge terms, which are medical subject heading. Emma discussed this in that lecture, and also the keywords and their synonyms. And something very, very important that I think many people are not yet aware of is the press guidelines or the press checklist, which is kind of a guideline for designing a robust search strategy. And this is really critical because if your search strategy is not robust, it's not sensitive, it's not specific enough, you might miss a lot of studies. And in that way, you're already having a biased review. So the results you're going to have, it's not going to be coming from all possible papers on the topic. And another consideration is that you should get feedback from a librarian or information specialist. This is very important. Unless you are very sure, you should always seek advice from a librarian or an information specialist because they are actually experts at search strategy and database exploration and management. So in our review, this is how we laid out our strategy for search and for identifying studies. So the we consulted both electronic databases, and we also looked at some gray literature. So for electronic databases, we look at PubMed, CINAHL, Scopus, Academic Search Premier, Africa-wide information, and Africa Journals Online. And we used mesh terms in Medline, and we used CINAHL headings in Scopus. And we also use some free words. I'll show you the search strategy later on, how we use the different words to develop them. But this is very similar to how we described it in the module on literature review. And for gray literature, we try to supplement all the material we have in the electronic search by also looking at some key websites. That's the websites of the United Nations, UNAIDS, WHO, and International AIDS Society to make sure we are not missing some papers. And you can even go as far as contacting some key experts in the field if they have some data that has not been published. So this is a very clear document on the press guidelines that I advise everyone who's conducting a systematic review to have a look. If you get the search strategy wrong, I can tell you a lot of things are going to go wrong down the line because you are just going to be screening and combining studies, and you would have left out a lot of studies because you did not make a very robust search strategy. So when you get the search strategy right, the next step, oh, before I move on, let me maybe show the search strategy that we used. And this is the one based on PubMed. So here you have the advanced search aspect of PubMed that you can use to build a search strategy like this. We already covered that in that lecture. You can go back. And if you are lost, you can always go to the website and see the recording of the video. And I'm showing here only the search strategy for other databases. So the next step will be to plan study selection. And you do study selection by doing screening, right? And it is recommended for systematic reviews to do it as a two-step process. So a dual screening process where you first screen titles and abstracts, and then you screen full text. So imagine that you've applied the search strategy that we have here, and you have 1,572 papers. So all these papers, among all of these papers, you have papers that meet your inclusion criteria, and you still have some papers there that do not meet. So you want to select the correct papers from the ones that are not the right papers for your review. And with those 1,572 papers, you cannot just go look at each of those papers. It's going to be very painful. So you want to first start by looking at only the title and the abstract and see whether by title and abstract they meet the inclusion criteria. And in that step, you select some of the papers and then you exclude some of the papers. And the papers that you include after this step, you go again through the screening process. Now you're looking at the full text. And for the full text, you are more likely to be very precise. So the first step, there's little precision. That usually just by reading the title and abstract, you can tell very much what paper is obviously an paper to be excluded. And for papers that you are not very sure to exclude, you move them to the full text stage. And so at each of these steps, particularly in the full text page, you want to document the reason for excluding that paper. And this is part of the reasons uh, for, for emphasizing on transparency and reproducibility. So someone can go look at whether the search strategy that you used pick the right papers. It's really important to document the reasons for exclusion because reviewers sometimes might ask that you show all the papers and justify why you excluded each of them. This is painful process, but highly recommended. And there are different tools that you can use for study selection and for screening. So you can use Excel. This is not very recommended. There's some online software like Ryan has a free version and it has a paid version. So the free version might work for small reviews with small number of reviewers. You also have Covidence, you have AP Reviewer. There are also some very good tools. At CRENC, we use Ryan and then we use AP Reviewer. If you're doing a very small review, you might use Excel, but this is not very recommended in today's modern world. And you can describe very well the process of selection of these studies by using the Prisma flow chart. We are going to see an example. And so in our review, in our protocol, this is how we described our screening process. We said 2 investigators will independently screen titles and abstracts using the inclusion criteria. Full text will then be obtained and screened using a standardized and pre-tested form to include eligible studies. Disagreements will be resolved by consensus or by consulting a third investigator. We will contact corresponding authors of potentially eligible studies for relevant data that we are not reported. Reasons for exclusion of non-eligible studies will be documented. The entire selection process will be summarized in the Prisma flowchart. So this is typical template for a Prisma flowchart. You must at the identification stage. So after applying your search strategy, you must describe the numbers, then your screening, which is both the title and abstract screening stage and the full text, and how many met inclusion criteria and so on. So this example is coming from our final result from our paper. So the Lancet likes it presented in this way, and you can see that we started off in our search. We identified 6,349 potential eligible studies from different bases. So you combine all the results you get from the different databases and you conduct duplication, because a study can appear in PubMed and also appear in Scopus results. So by duplicating, make sure that you are not including a paper twice or more. And after you've deduplicated, you conduct screening. So the first step, we did title and abstract screening for 3,117 papers. So these were two different people screening title and abstracts of all these papers. And at this stage, we excluded 2,506. So usually it's quite obvious that this paper doesn't meet your inclusion criteria. For example, you might see a paper done in mice and your subjects of interest are human beings, so you exclude that paper. You might see something very obvious from title or abstract that points out that this obviously doesn't meet my criteria, so you kick it out. So we went further to include 611 papers in the full text stage. So we looked at 611 papers from the beginning to the end, and we excluded 427, and these are the different summary of the different reasons for excluding these papers. And at the end of the study selection process, we included 184 studies, which we conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis on. So this is kind of something that is expected when you hear about systematic reviews. You must give people an idea about how you selected those studies. So in your protocol, the next thing is you must decide on data extraction. When I look at this full text for these included studies, what data am I going to extract? How am I going to extract it? So you must define what information to collect. This can be information related to the paper, can be the study characteristics, can be some particular outcomes or other forms of data. And you can do extraction using Excel, which is quite easier. This one place where I would really recommend Excel. I've tried several different extraction methods, but the method that works better would depend on the complexity of your review. If you have too many data points, it might be hard to use maybe a questionnaire. You could use something like a Google form to collect the data, but it can be very complex if you have very complex review. But if you have a very simpler review, you might use something like Google form. But generally, what will work for all forms of review will be Excel, in my own experience. And the problem with Excel is that you have to be careful not to make errors as you enter or to, by mistake, somehow delete something, a value in a cell. And some other tools like AP Reviewer have some built-in functionality for data extraction. And again, you want to think about doing it not just you alone, but with another person. If it's too painful to extract data for maybe 184 papers, you might consider allocating 10% of the papers to another reviewer to extract. And at each of those stages, maybe at the screening of title and abstract, screening of full text and extraction, and to compare the agreement between the two different people who are either screening the studies or extracting the data. And you have to report this because you doing it alone, you might make mistakes. And since a systematic review is a robust system, you want to see the extent to which you are not making false conclusions. You are not drawing false conclusions, the extent to which you are not making mistakes. So you must plan on how you justify the agreement between the different people who are conducting these different steps. So in our review, this is how we reported it. We first of all said the data for this review will be extracted using a purposeful design and piloted form on Excel. So you have to do this at the protocol stage. You don't go determine the items to screen when you're already seeing the results. It's not correct. So further, we said two investigators will independently extract data from included studies, and any inconsistencies or disagreements shall be resolved by consensus between those two reviewers or consultation with a third investigator. So this is how resolutions are done when two people are screening. So we looked at various different data items. Generally, we looked at author and paper details, which will be author name. These are the items that we really get from the paper. And then we get the study characteristics such as country, study design, whether it's a national or subnational study setting, sample size, and so on. We also said we'll get participant characteristics such as their mean age, their median age, and then we're also going to get some information on HIV-related factors such as time since diagnosis, severity of disease, CD4 count, viral load, and so on. And we were also going to get prevalence measures, which were key outcome for our review. And we were going to get two key aspects for determining prevalence, the numerator and the denominator. And lastly, to also extract data on associations of HIV-specific factors and our different cardiometabolic risk factors. So this is what we described in our paper, and I'll show later on here on how our extraction form looked like. You can see here we kind of used Excel and separated the different aspects into different sheets to make it easier for extraction. So each paper has a unique ID, which really helps when you are analyzing or synthesizing them. So this is very important. And we obtained this directly from AP Reviewer because we used AP Reviewer for the screening stages. And so you can see here the study details. And then here you have the study characteristics. So you have like the author year, the study design, whether it's national or subnational. So each of these different items, like the country, the age, the UN AIDS region, which you can get by from country, WHO region, income level, and so on. You get each of these from the papers. So you go into each paper and you look for the data and you fill this Excel sheet. So this is very cumbersome and tedious process, and two people have to do it. And you can also see for the prevalence sheet, you can see we have for hypertension, for example, of the numerator and the denominator. So some studies that did not report for hypertension, you see they are blank. Then here you have a numerator and its denominator. And for prevalence meta-analysis, you always have to get both the numerator and prevalence and the denominator. You don't get the percentage. If, for example, you have the numerator and the percentage, you can use that to determine the denominator. So what you record is the numerator and the denominator for meta-analysis of prevalence. If you're doing meta-analysis for something like means, then you just collect the data on the means. So the next step will be to assess risk of bias. So why are you doing risk of bias assessment? Risk of bias kind of helps you to, first of all, you're bringing studies that are conducted under different conditions, different study settings. They're using different study designs, and they're using different participant selection processes and all different sorts of things that are different. And this introduces bias because you're combining things that are not very similar. And there must be a way that you ensure that you account for these biases that are there, that are existing between studies and within studies. And so you must have a system for accounting for it. And that whole process is called risk of bias assessment. So you must choose an appropriate risk of bias tool. And there are different types of risk of bias tools depending on the study design, the kind of research question. So many. For prevalence measures, one commonly used version is the one described by Hoy and colleagues. You have the risk of bias tool from Cochrane. You have the Newcastle Ottawa scale. So depending on your research question and the kind of maybe synthesis method that you want to use, you want to pick the appropriate risk of bias tool. And again, like for the screening stages or the data extraction stages, you want to get two people to screen for risks of bias, and then you resolve agreements and report it. And when you are reporting your results or when you are synthesizing them, like I mentioned, you have to account for the risks of bias, and you do this through some subgroup analysis and so on. We'll see that shortly. So this is how we described it in our protocol. Assessment of methodological quality of studies and risk of bias. We said two reviewers will independently score the quality of the included studies. For each study, the risk of bias and evaluation of methodological quality will be checked using the risk of bias tool for prevalence studies. And any discrepancies will be resolved by consensus or by consulting the third investigator. Inter-rater agreement on screening, data extraction, and methodological quality will be assessed using the Cohen's-Kappa coefficient. The quality assessment scores will be presented in a table for easy interpretation. So this is how the sheet on risk of bias looks like. You can see for each study, we graded it on the 10 different scores as described by Hoy and colleagues. So we adapted the risk of bias tool by Hoy and colleagues. And for each study, you could see we summarize it as maybe low risk of bias, moderate risk of bias, and so on. And this is how it looks in the final paper. We made a very good summary here of the different points, items, and how it varied across different studies. So the last step will be to outline how you're going to combine the different papers, aka synthesis. And you must decide on whether you're going to conduct just a narrative synthesis or a narrative synthesis and meta-analysis, or whether this is just pure meta-analysis. So for our review, we did a narrative synthesis and a meta-analysis. And there are other considerations that you must have. How are you going to handle heterogeneity? So heterogeneity means discrepancies across papers and within papers. As I mentioned, in addition to the risk of bias, it doesn't just end there. You must let people know how you're going to account for the differences or the variance across the different papers. And you do this by reporting I-squared. We'll see that. And you do subgroup analysis and sensitivity analysis to account for these discrepancies or variances across the different studies. Also, you must define the methods for sensitivity and subgroup analysis. How are you going to do it? So this is very elaborate. I won't read all of it, but we describe in detail how we're going to conduct the synthesis. And this is very critical because you must define it beforehand. You don't reach at the final step after seeing the results and you start formulating a way to synthesize it, introduces bias. So this is very important to outline in the protocol. It's one of the key reasons for writing the protocol in the first place. And so here we describe particularly how we are going to synthesize numerical data. So how we are going to conduct meta-analysis. So we describe the meta-analytic and meta-regression analysis for both, for getting the pool prevalence and for getting the associations for the second review question. And so we said we're going to use a random effects model to get the pool prevalence. And we're going to use several different statistical strategies for adjusting the variance, the variance from the different studies. So we use methods like Freeman, Turkey, double axine transformations to first transform the different prevalence estimates before combining them. And we also describe how we're going to manage heterogeneity. So we're using different measures for assessing heterogeneity. We use the Cochrane Q statistic, I-squared, and there is tau squared, and so on. There are so many of them. And another key aspect that you must address is publication bias. And for that, And maybe let me touch a little bit on publication bias. Why is publication bias important? Remember that as you're going to be looking at studies, these are going to be studies that are published, right? So they are going to be papers that have not yet been published. And if you wanted to get the true estimate of the measure that you are interested in, it will be some data also coming from studies that people have not published. And people might not publish these studies for different reasons. One of them might be that they they saw that the results were negative and they decided not to publish. But the fact that that exists somewhere and is not reported is a bias, and that's called publication bias. And so for your review to say, oh, this is the conclusion, this is the value that we have, you must account for what you did not find in papers. And one of those assessment is done using funnel plots and Eggers test, which is the statistical version. We'll see that shortly. And then you also describe your methods for subgroup analysis and meta regression. So all those different aspects in the data items that we mentioned earlier, you want to collect that data and this will help you stratify your findings by these different characteristics. I'll show you later on how we do that in practice. And you must describe sensitivity analysis to go further. So you do things like leave one out, jackknife sensitivity strategy, you do budget plots and so on to kind of give the reviewers a very good sense that the result you have obtained is a robust result. And that's the whole point of the systematic reviews. So let me speak a little bit about narrative synthesis because this is really important. You want to use narrative synthesis when meta-analysis is not feasible, or you use it in combination with the meta-analysis. And so you could always almost expect a narrative synthesis to be part of a systematic review by default. So you hear something in the results section that reads in the direction of, according to this, we found that this was this, that. And in Nigeria, these studies found that this, that. So you're kind of describing things. And one way to kind of combine things in the narrative sense is to do what we usually do in qualitative studies, which is like thematic analysis. So you might want to combine studies by a certain theme. So you describe that, let me say, studies that are from a certain aspect. Maybe if you were conducting a review, let me say a review on determining, let me say, methods for assessing missing data and so on, you might look at a certain aspect, like for example, component of missing data, type of missingness, is it missing at random or so on. So you might categorize studies by that theme. You might also categorize studies by population, maybe studies done in Sub-Saharan Africa, studies done in Europe, studies done in this WHO region, and so on. If it's a systematic review of like trial data, you might want to categorize them or synthesize them by intervention versus by outcome, and so on. And in the narrative synthesis, you highlight patterns, consistencies, and contradictions. This is kind of how you synthesize things in qualitative research. So narrative synthesis kind of aligns with qualitative with thematic analysis in qualitative research. And you can display the results as tables. You can put them as thematic categories, word clouds, and textual summaries, and so on. And you must define your protocol very early on how you're going to do the narrative synthesis, because this will maintain transparency. So for synthesis that are numerical or quantitative, you can either do the fixed effects or the random effects model. So fixed effects model, you use them when you are quite confident that the estimate are very similar across studies. But since this is hardly the case, we often go with random effects model because they can be different. It's almost in most systematic reviews and meta-analysis, they will use the random effects model, and the most popular one is the Desimoinian-Lade method. I won't go into the statistical methods for now, maybe in a subsequent presentation. And I'm showing you here a sample of our results. So this is a forest plot of the meta-analysis for for waist circumference, which is one of the cardiometabolic risk factors that we're interested in. And you can see the first aspect is the effect size. So the effect size of interest here is prevalence. So you have the general prevalence. So you can see each of the different prevalences from each of the different studies, and the prevalence, the pool prevalence or the combined prevalence for this particular subgroup. So we did subgroup analysis. So you can see by waist circumference criteria here. So you have a sub prevalence for each of the criteria, and then you have an overall one. So we also report heterogeneity, and for this particular study, we report I-squared, which is 93.7. It kind of reports that the studies were remarkably different. So there was a lot of heterogeneity. And then you should learn how to interpret these forest plots. We'll see that in the lecture that we'll have in the near future on how to read graphs. And also publication bias. Let me show you subgroup analysis here. This is a more tabular form of the data. So you can see that we have an overall estimate for all the studies, but we also have an estimate by criteria, studies that use standard criteria for hypertension versus those who did not. You can see their own pool prevalences, and we can see for those studies, their heterogeneity level. This is another measure of heterogeneity, and we can have the p-value for whether the heterogeneity assessment across studies was statistically significant or not. And we can also have an assessment of the publication bias for each. So this is an example of subgroup analysis with a lot of sensitivity analysis results. So you have statistical analysis, a lot of statistical analysis going on here. So you might want to look at this when I share the slides. So this is publication bias assessments. So this is what we call funnel plots, which kind of, each bubble here represents a study, and how these studies lie relative to this funnel here depicts whether there is some publication bias or not. If there is symmetry between both sides, then there is a less risk. So I've added, you can see in this result, I've added the EGAS test here, which is statistically significant, meaning that there was some statistically significant publication bias here. So you combine EGAS test as a statistical measure and these funnel plots, which are kind of like more visual inspection or assessment of publication bias. And one interesting thing about the EGAS test is that I did not really know that this was developed by Matthias Eger, which is one of the key investigators in IeDEA, Southern Africa. And I was really surprised later on when Prof. Marcel told me that he's the one who developed EGAS test. So we really have some strong methodologies in the IeDEA cohort or among investigators. So the last aspect of our presentation, we've taken really a lot of time, but let me just quickly go through this, is that when you've prepared your protocol, you have to have a way to report the protocol. And the Equator Consortium have different ways of doing this. So for different types of studies, there are different guidelines for reporting. So for example, our stroke guidelines, which I think a lot of you are already familiar with, is what we use for observational studies. For systematic reviews, you must use the PRISMA guidelines for reporting the full report. But for the protocol, there is a variant called the PRISMA P guidelines. So let's look at the different items. You can see here, you read each item and you look at what you've prepared and ensure that it aligns with what is here. So by going through each of these different points, you are going to be kind of sure whether you've developed a comprehensive strategy. And so when you are submitting, whether it's your protocol or your final review, the journals often ask you to also submit this ticked. So I'm just going to go over this. So in conclusion, systematic reviews and meta-analysis are powerful tools for evidence-based synthesis. And a well-written protocol is your roadmap. So it ensures clarity, transparency, and reproducibility. Each step in protocol development builds the foundation for a very rigorous review. And the PRISMA P guidelines or protocol that I just showed will help you to structure and communicate your protocol effectively. As take-home message, a strong protocol isn't just a formality. It is your first step towards a trustworthy and impactful review. Thank you very much for your attention.